Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Raise your hand if you can hear me. Okay. In 1951, the Knesset declared into state law that the 27th of Nisan shall become the commemoration day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and shall be called Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, a day to remember the Holocaust and heroism. Yom HaShoah is observed in different ways in different places. In America, there are memorial services in synagogues during which yahrzeit candles are lit, memorial prayers are said, names of those who died are read, and the community stops to remember its loss during the Holocaust. What is the Holocaust? According to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust refers to the systematic destruction of European Jewry at the hands of the Nazis during World War II. 6 million is the number of deaths we generally associate with the Shoah. But the truth is that we'll never know the actual number of victims because the Nazis were highly successful in destroying evidence of their crimes. The most current research suggests that the number may well be much higher than 6 million. Along with the deaths of this incomprehensible number, it must be remembered that an entire way of life perished as well. Before the Holocaust, Eastern Europe was the numerical, religious, and cultural center of the Jewish people. Today, only echoes remain of that world. Most important, we have to remember that the Jews did not perish as a single entity. They died one by one, including over 1.5 million children. Each person died in his or her own way, leaving behind those who loved them and a life that was incomplete, unfinished. Today, we come together as a community to mourn the incalculable loss to the Jewish community. We're really fortunate this morning that we have with us Professor Danny Cohen, parent, activist, professor, author, musician, who's going to lead us in a discussion about his story that I hope you all read called The 19th Window. So with that, I'm going to ask Danny to just provide a quick summary of the story for those of you who may have read it a while ago and don't completely remember. So Danny, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see lots of faces, including many faces that I know. I miss seeing you all in our actual school building. It's good to be here this morning. So thank you, Jeff, for your introduction. We're going to jump in, and I'm going to provide a little bit of a summary, the summary, we're going to start jumping into the story, and we're going to start some discussion straight away. And I want to, before we jump into the story, I want to share with you, if you could raise your hand, who here has heard, and you can raise your hand through Zoom with little hand raises if you like, or you can just raise your actual hand, who here has heard of the Holocaust Education Initiative, Zikaron B'Salon? Has anyone heard of it? Zikaron B'Salon? I see a couple of hands up. So Zikaron B'Salon is a project that was founded in Israel for Yom HaShoah. Usually when we think of Yom HaShoah, we think of, as Jeff explained, reading names and ceremonies and very formal commemorations. Zikaron B'Salon is this initiative to get groups of people together, usually in a living room. Zikaron Basalan is this idea of remembering in the living room. And right now, Zikaron Basalan, right now all over the world, not only in Israel, people are gathering on Zoom and other platforms to learn together and to discuss and have conversations about Holocaust history, with the idea that learning and education is a form of commemoration in and of itself. So that's kind of the spirit that we're bringing with us today. So the 19th window, I wrote a number of years ago, and we start with our protagonist, Lydia, receiving 2 envelopes from her mother. She's about to turn 18, and her mother says, take these envelopes and leave them, when you go on your trip to Poland, leave them at a mass grave. Do it for me, sweetie, do it for your grandma. And Lydia goes off on this group trip, which may sound familiar to many of us, where she is going to visit sites of Nazi atrocity in Poland. And very early on in the story, we see that Lydia is really nervous, very apprehensive, sick to her stomach, with this idea of visiting these sites of Nazi atrocity. I'd like to start us off with a question, and we can use the raise your hand feature. Would anyone like to share why is it so common for us that before we start to learn about the Holocaust, or before we take a trip, or before we decide to go to a Holocaust museum, or before we even watch a movie about the Holocaust, why do so many of us experience this sickness in our stomach, this sort of physical, almost anxiety? And I'd love to hear from the young people first, before we hear from the adults. Would anyone like to share? Why is it so common for many of us to experience these emotions before we even start to talk about Holocaust history?
Why doesn't somebody unmute their mic and go ahead and respond to the question if they'd like?
Well, I was gonna say that, like, what I thought of is when we went to the Holocaust Museum on our DC trip, I kind of like had that feeling as well, because we spend so much time throughout our time at school, like learning about these things and like talking about our roots and like who we are. It's like kind of the second family, like your religion. So hearing about like all these horrible things and having like that last kind of puzzle piece our learning, I think that is like a cause of that feeling, and like that kind of icky feeling or any of those like sad things. It's just because it feels like something bad happening to someone in your family.
Thank you so much. Anyone else want to share? You can raise your hand through the Zoom feature if you want to speak, or you can just unmute yourself.
I think that like people like feel like sick like inside, because it's like all these Jews were murdered for something that like wasn't right, and for something that like just didn't make sense, and there was like no reason behind it. So it's like you're going like to like a yard site, but there's no like explanation behind it. Like they can't say like why they died.
Right. Thank you.
I think it's
terrible that so many people had to perish for absolutely no reason, just because one person believed it was right and he was able to get an entire nation behind him to also believe that this was true, even though it wasn't. And so many lives were lost just because of one man's thought process.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I think it's common because we can't imagine what it was like, and when we try to imagine how hard it was, that gives us a bad. We can't imagine it, and so, but we know it was bad, so that just makes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Also, I think like what you were talking about in the 19th window, we often feel like we're forced to feel something, or we have to feel the cliches at a certain moment. So that could be a reason that you do eventually start to feel it.
Great. More thoughts? Would anyone like to reflect on Lydia herself? As I said, we begin the story with Lydia receiving these two letters that she knows are, the envelopes had handwriting that appeared to be her grandmother's handwriting. And so for Lydia, we have this extra layer. She isn't just learning about the history of her community, she's also learning about, or maybe learning about, the history of her own family, her immediate family. Would anyone like to share their thoughts on what might it be like for grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to learn about Holocaust history? Is it a different experience? Is it a different feeling? Is it similar to the wider Jewish community?
Well, like what I was thinking of is throughout the discussions previously in the year, stories are that much more powerful when you put a face to it and you connect someone that you've heard of or know. So I feel like having a relative or someone that's like related to you, it can make the story stronger. You feel like you have a deeper connection. But also you can imagine like similar to what someone said before, like what that experience was like. Because learning about it, you can imagine it's awful, but having someone that you know go through it, like something that you probably would never expect them to go through, like just being able to hear that from them and discover this on your own, especially for like, sorry, it's like kind of forgot my train of thought. But I feel like just having someone that went through that, it just makes the story like that much stronger. And then it can change the way that you view a certain event.
Thank you so much.
Also, like relating up Zoe, like at least here when you go to the Holocaust Museum, like you get like a card of a specific survivor, and or I don't know if it's just survivors, but it like Zoe was saying, it like makes the experience so much more meaningful, because you're like connecting with like the person that like you have.
Thank you.
I think that, like they were saying, it's really important that there's a personal connection. And with that, I don't think it only makes the story more meaningful, but it also makes it seem more real. This was a time where like people were saying before, things had no explanation, and there was a lot of chaos, and things were really confusing why everything was happening and why the Jews were this chosen people that like had to perish. So by having somebody who actually went through it, it's like a justification that, okay, this happened. I can connect to it. Maybe I can
maybe I can try to understand it better because I've had an ancestor go through it.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'd like this to be. I'd like this experience to be sort of meaningful to you, and so I'd now like to welcome any questions you might have about the 19th window as you were reading it. Jeff, feel free to ask me questions as well. Is there anything in particular about the story that stood out to you? Is there anything that you found yourself wanting to know as you were reading it?
Well, I'm going to start out with a question, which is, I've read the story before, but I didn't realize that you were the author of that story, that you had created that story. So my question is why? Why did you choose to write this particular story? Is it somehow connected to experiences in your own life?
Yeah, okay. I don't usually get that question, but but it's a good question. I wrote The 19th Window because I found it really difficult to write about my own family, if I'm really honest. So I tried to write. So my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. I never met him. He died before I was born. He died when my mom was just 12 years old. And the stories that I heard, here's something that I think is worth talking about to help answer the question. I think we often have a stereotype of a survivor in our head of someone who is comfortable and confident and travels to schools and tells their story. Someone who is strong and tries to empower communities through their words and through their storytelling. We have this maybe cliche, but this stereotype of a survivor, right? My grandfather, the stories I was told about him were about how kind he was, about what a great sense of humor he had, how much he loved his family. But I also know that he never spoke about what happened to him during the war. He never talked about his family who were murdered. He never talked about the Holocaust. And so this is true for many Holocaust survivors. The survivors we interact with now in 2020 through video or in our own school or on tape or even in interactive holograms at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and elsewhere, if you've seen that. The reality is that many survivors never told their stories. We should unpack that and ask why. And so my grandfather was one of those who never spoke. He was silent. And I started to write about this from my own perspective, and I was really struggling. I couldn't find a way to write about my own feelings about my grandfather's silence. And I also struggled to write about my own experience visiting Poland for the first time. And so what I found much easier was to fictionalize my own story. And so I created Lydia kind of as a proxy for myself. So if you read The 19th Window, if you read it, Lydia is kind of me. There are many feelings she has and many things that happen to Lydia that actually happen to me. And so to answer your question, Jeff, why did I write The 19th Window? I wrote it to process my own relationship to the Holocaust, if that makes sense, my own relationship to Holocaust history. But the way I did it, choosing fiction as a vehicle to help me process was something that I didn't really intend to do. I just sort of fell into it accidentally. So many of you, if you're struggling to write, sometimes it is easier to write from someone else's perspective, or create a fictional character. It might help you write more easily. What I'd like to ask you, and this is actually a question that one of you submitted last night, which is, why did some survivors not speak? So the camps are liberated, Europe is liberated, the Nazis are defeated, and yet many Holocaust survivors did not speak, did not tell their stories. Why might that be? Would anyone like to jump in and just share your thoughts? Why were some survivors silent?
I'll offer something. And I say this as the son-in-law of the survivor. It is very, very difficult for my mother-in-law to talk about her experiences and her family experiences in the war, because it's not something she can look back at without also feeling it. It's not something you can tell dispassionately. It's something that she's spent her life trying to live through. And that's quite a challenge into itself.
Yes. So this block, perhaps, these barriers, right, that we often put up, that prevent us from talking about our own experiences, especially if they are extreme, right? Would anyone else like to share your thoughts?
I just want to jump in real quickly and say that for those of you, we've been studying Elie Wiesel this year, and the students know that he took an oath that for 10 years, he wasn't going to speak about the Holocaust. And at least in part, I think it has to do with the limitations of language. That's part of it. That there are some events, there are some things in our life for which language fails us. The words are just not there. And for the survivors, how could they possibly convey to us the unimaginable?
I think it's also, you're making me think, Jeff, about this idea of denial. And I'm not talking about Holocaust denial, that's a whole other kind of denial. But I'm thinking about the survivors I've spoken to who will often frame their stories as hopeful, frame their stories as, oh, I went through this and it all happened for a reason, sort of like this idea of trying to rationalize. Many of you, just earlier, many of the students, you were talking about how the Holocaust really happened for no reason, right? I really liked that framing, that maybe we shouldn't try to find explanations for this horrific event. And so this idea of denial, some survivors just could not come to terms with what happened. The only way they could live their lives after the Holocaust was to put it out of their minds. We also have, early on in Israel and around the world, we have psychologists and doctors actually telling Holocaust survivors, don't talk about this. It's better for you if you don't talk about this. Our our understanding of therapy, psychotherapy, counseling has shifted dramatically over the last 75 years. But early on, survivors were told it's actually better for your mental health to keep this in. Now we know it's the opposite is true, right? It's actually better for our mental health to speak openly and to process and to find a therapist. It's much better for you to do that. But early on, survivors were encouraged to stay silent. And so we have all of these sort of confounding factors coming together, and we have a number of survivors not speaking. It also reminds me, I just noticed on my own shelf behind me, we have Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Raise your hand if you've read Mouse. Many of you. So there's a moment in Mouse, and this relates back to the 19th window, where Art is talking about his mother, and it's the section in Mouse where his mother dies by suicide. She takes her own life. In the 19th window, we also discover that Lydia's grandmother also took her own life. This is another phenomenon amongst survivors. We don't talk about it that much, but there were many survivors who ended their own lives. So my question to you is, why do we not talk about this phenomenon very much? Why do we very often frame survivors as being brave and truth tellers and inspiring? Why don't we talk about the survivors who stay silent? Why don't we talk about the survivors who suffered depression, PTSD, and even took their own lives? Would anyone like to share? Why don't we talk about that part of the history?
People really like to say about the Holocaust that it'll never happen again. And I mean, it's obvious that it has, but we say that because we don't want anything like that to ever happen again. And the only way you can prevent that is if people speak out about the problem. So it's a lot easier to pretend that the Holocaust was a once in a lifetime, a once in the world thing, if you pretend that all of the Holocaust survivors felt compelled to speak out about it.
Thank you. That's great. Yes. Anyone else?
I feel like many Holocaust survivors, since they got through such a tragic time, it's like, wow, this is like truly an amazing person to go through all this like history and still be here to talk about it, so others can like be educated on this topic. But for the people that did take their life, I feel like even I didn't really know much about that until now, like actual survivors taking their lives. Because I feel like to a lot of people, it's like taboo, like that topic to just be completely avoided. So I do think that is something that should be talked about more, because throughout this whole like year, I still didn't really hear much about that. I heard about people like taking their lives while in the camp, but I haven't heard of actual survivors doing that. So I think that that's definitely something that should be talked about more.
Thank you.
We were on like a Jewish identity meeting yesterday, and there was like what someone was speaking, and they were talking about how their like father, every year on a Jewish holiday, the father had a heart attack, and he was a Holocaust survivor, and I just like found that really interesting because it was a scamsy, and I found it like really interesting because it's like you don't hear that a lot, but it like connects to like PTSD and your health, and it's like all this traumatic experience. It can affect so much.
Yes, yes, yes.
Is it okay if I also say something?
Please.
Okay. I think there's also a historical piece here. When survivors started coming to Israel after the creation of the state, they did not talk about what they went through because the chalutzim, the pioneers that lived in Israel at the time, were this new Jew, strong, and would never go to die in the way, that's what they thought. They would never go and die in the way that the survivors' families did. So it was very embarrassing to be that weak Jew, not rebellious Jew. The Jew that would just be led like sheep to slaughter. So I think, and then later Israel also added to the Holocaust Day, the Shoah Day, the Shoah and the Hagvura, which means the heroism. And suddenly we have this new angle. And I think that is part of the reason we don't like to talk about that side. We want to be presented with this rebellious Jew, the strong Jew that survived something like that, and not with, well, it was horrible and I cannot even fathom how hard it was, and so I'm going to end my own life. It's a very different notion than what we present in Israel.
Yes, thank you. How much time do we have left? I'm cognizant of.
We have about, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes left. I want to also add that I think about my own parents and in relation to the Holocaust. And I think that for a lot of American Jews after the Holocaust, it's not totally dissimilar to what was happening in Israel, is after what the Jews had been through during the war, that there was a sense that we have to kind of blend in somehow. We don't want to stand out too much, because look at what happens when Jews are clearly defined. So there was a sense of becoming Americanized. Just move on, fit in, blend in, and don't go back to that part of history, because that separates us rather than integrates us.
I think that's right. I think at the same time, and this is something I try to do in my own work, I think we're often told, just as survivors were sort of told how to respond. Don't talk about this. Don't make a fuss. We're not going to talk about the survivors who are suffering from depression. We're not going to talk about survivors suffering from PTSD. We're going to spotlight the strong survivors with stories of resistance and so on. At the same time, I think we also often get told how to feel about the Holocaust when we study it, right? And I think we owe it to ourselves to be honest and allow ourselves to feel many things. It's okay to feel all sorts of emotions when we study Holocaust history, when we remember Holocaust history. It doesn't have to just be sadness. We can also feel anger. We can also feel deep frustration. We can also feel nothing. It's very possible to study the Holocaust and remember the Holocaust and actually feel numb, and have this sense of no emotion. Sometimes we hear from our teachers, sometimes we hear from our parents, this should make you really sad, or this should make you feel really hopeful, or this should make you feel connected to our community. But I don't think we can ever tell anyone how to feel. I think that that's up to each of us individually to navigate our own emotions. I remember visiting a museum when I was in high school, and our teacher said something like if you don't cry, then you need to really look in carefully to yourself, because there's something wrong if you don't cry. There's something wrong with you. It means you're not connecting to the history properly. And I remember feeling this pressure to cry. But as we now know, in the 21st century, our understanding of emotion shifted. It's up to everyone to determine their own emotional response. You can't tell other people how to feel. And so if you're ever finding yourself trying to put pressure on someone else, or if someone else is telling you to feel a certain thing, it's okay to push back and say, at least in your own head, and say, you know what, no, I'm gonna just react in my own way. If anyone has, I know we have to wrap up, but we're actually moving on to a new part of this. We're gonna do a candle lighting now, I believe. I want to thank you for this, for your participation today, whether that's been vocal or just listening. Listening is just as important in communication as talking. So thank you for talking and listening. If you do have any more questions about the 19th window specifically, you are very, very, very welcome to reach out, send me questions. I'd be very glad to answer them. Back over to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. And I'm going to turn it over to Leon, because Leon's going to lead us in the Kaddish and candle lighting.
The Kaddish is one of the candles. There's one in my background, but the Kaddish is, in fact, and just very quickly, the Kaddish is a way for the community to share in sorrow. Apart from anything else, one can traditionally says the Kaddish with a minyan, a quorum, 10 people. And it's calling for the community to get together, to support, to be there. And one of the reasons why we say it so often, whether it's in Yom HaShoah today, Yom HaZikaron, at a Shiva house, in a synagogue throughout our prayers, times when we even learn, very often they'll do that. It's a time of communal responsibility, community getting together. And I'd like to thank everyone, first of all, for coming for joining in. And of course, I'd like to thank Dr. Cohen and Dr. Ellison and everyone who participated. If you know the Kaddish, please continue to say it with me. And the end, whilst we're leaving, we'd like to, there will be a tune going on. Please, Nalakum, wherever you are, whether hopefully you're sitting up, now you'll be standing up, which is part of the tradition for many people. But today being Yom HaShoah, we'd like everyone to stand as we say Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitgadash merabah, v'amad livrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon uvyomechon ובחיי תכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבם מברך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח, ויתפאר, ויתרומם, ויתנשא, ויתהדר, ויתעלה, ויתהלל בשמי קודשה בריחו. לעילם כל ברכתה ושירתה, תשבחתה ונחמתה, דאמרן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלום רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עשה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו amen. Today being Yom HaShoah, please take the time if you can, or you'll make the time to learn about someone as we go through the next few hours with Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. is that's the conclusion of our Yom HaShoah Tekes. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Music will go on whilst we're finishing the. Thank you.